March 1944, Podington Airfield, Bedfordshire. The mission board listed Berlin as the primary target, 327 miles deep into Reich airspace. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosenthal watched his bomber crews study the red yarn stretching across the wall map, calculating in their heads what every man in the room already knew. This mission exceeded the published combat radius of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress by nearly 200 miles. The mathematics were brutal and non-negotiable. Standard fuel load, standard cruise settings, standard doctrine. The bombers could reach the target, drop their ordnance, and run out of fuel somewhere over occupied Holland. No fighter escort for the final leg, no fuel reserves for combat maneuvering, no margin for error if headwinds increased or flak damage forced altitude changes. Yet, the mission was scheduled. The aircraft were being fueled. And in a corner of the operations room, a civilian, technical advisor named Stanley Hooker, was quietly watching bomber crews resign themselves to what they assumed would be a one-way trip to Berlin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hooker had spent 6 weeks at Podington, observing how American bomber crews managed fuel consumption during deep penetration raids. The Rolls-Royce engineer had designed the supercharger systems that powered both the British Spitfire and the American-built Packard Merlin engines. But his expertise extended beyond individual fighter aircraft to the strategic bombing campaign that was consuming young men faster than training schools could replace them. The fuel consumption rates he witnessed defied every principle of efficient engine operation. Bomber pilots ran their Wright Cyclone engines rich, prioritizing mechanical reliability over fuel efficiency. Power settings remained constant, regardless of altitude or atmospheric conditions. Mixture controls stayed locked in auto-rich positions that consumed 15% more fuel than necessary. Standard operating procedure. Safe, predictable, and utterly inadequate for the missions that strategic bombing doctrine now demanded. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 7th, Rosenthal's bomber groups began their engine start procedures. 42 B-17G Flying Fortresses, each carrying 10 young men who understood the statistical probability of their own survival better than they understood the fuel systems keeping them airborne. Technical Sergeant James Mitchell, flight engineer aboard the B-17 designated Memphis Belle II, monitored his engine instruments with the mechanical precision that 6 months of combat operations had instilled. Oil pressure steady. Cylinder head temperatures climbing normally. Fuel flow reading 110 gallons per hour per engine. 4 Wright R, 1,000, 820 Cyclone engines burning 440 gallons hourly. Standard consumption rates that gave his bomber approximately 5 hours of flight time with full combat load. The mission to Berlin and back required 6 hours minimum, assuming perfect conditions that never existed over Nazi Germany. Mitchell had watched 3 bomber crews fail to return from deep penetration missions in the past month. Aircraft that had reached their targets successfully but run out of fuel during the return flight, forcing crews to bail out over enemy territory or attempt emergency landings in occupied France. The lucky ones became prisoners of war. The others died in aircraft that fell from the sky when their fuel tanks ran dry. But this morning, something was different about the fuel. The ground crews had made unusual modifications to the fuel trucks overnight. Additional filtration equipment, temperature monitoring devices, chemical testing apparatus that Mitchell had never seen at an operational bomber base. Hooker had spent the previous evening convincing group operations that his fuel modification technique would extend B-17 combat radius by approximately 30%. The proposal had been met with skepticism bordering on hostility from officers who had lost too many crews to mechanical failures and experimental modifications that failed under combat conditions. "Colonel, your bombers are burning fuel mixture developed for reciprocating engines operating at sea level," Hooker had explained, spreading technical specifications across the operations desk. The Wright Cyclones in these fortresses operate most efficiently at altitudes between 20 and 25,000 feet. But your fuel mixture was formulated for maximum power output, not maximum range. The aviation gasoline flowing into American bomber fuel tanks tested at 100 octane, sufficient for high-altitude operations, but chemically optimized for fighter aircraft that prioritized acceleration and combat maneuvering over sustained cruise efficiency. Hooker's modification involved adding a catalytic compound that altered the fuel's combustion characteristics at high altitude, reducing consumption while maintaining power output. The chemistry was complex. The implementation was dangerously simple. Add 3 gallons of the catalyst per 100 gallons of standard aviation fuel. The resulting mixture would burn leaner at altitude while producing equivalent power to standard fuel at sea level. If it worked, B-17 bombers could reach targets that German air defenses assumed were beyond Allied bombing range. If it failed, 42 aircraft would experience catastrophic fuel starvation over enemy territory, killing 420 American airmen in a single disastrous experiment. Group Commander Colonel Harold Timberlake had authorized a limited test. 6 bombers from Rosenthal's squadron would fly the Berlin mission using Hooker's modified fuel. The remaining 36 aircraft would use standard aviation gasoline. Whichever group returned with better fuel reserves would determine whether the modification became standard procedure or a cautionary tale about civilians interfering with combat operations. Mitchell's B-17 was one of the 6 aircraft fueled with Hooker's mixture. As his bomber climbed through 8,000 feet, he noticed the fuel flow gauges showing lower consumption than standard operations predicted. The Wright cyclones were producing full power while burning approximately 85 gallons per hour instead of the expected 110. Lead to flight engineer, Rosenthal's voice crackled over the intercom. Are you seeing what I'm seeing on these fuel flow numbers? Mitchell double-checked his instruments before responding. His training emphasized trusting gauges over instinct, but the readings contradicted 6 months of accumulated flight experience. Sir, we're showing approximately 20% fuel savings compared to standard cruise settings. If this holds, we'll have enough fuel to reach Berlin and return with normal reserves. The bomber formation climbed to 22,000 feet, settling into cruise configuration for the long flight across the English Channel and occupied Europe. German radar stations would track their approach from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast. Luftwaffe fighter wings would scramble to intercept. But for the first 2 hours of flight, the American formation would fly through relatively safe airspace, giving Mitchell time to analyze the modified fuel's performance under operational conditions. At altitude, the difference became more pronounced. Standard aviation fuel lost efficiency as atmospheric pressure decreased, forcing engines to work harder to maintain power output. Hooker's catalyst altered combustion chemistry in ways that compensated for thin air, allowing the Wright cyclones to burn leaner while maintaining manifold pressure. The bomber formation crossed into German airspace at 0930 hours. Flak batteries opened up with the familiar black clouds of exploding ordnance that made formation flying a constant exercise in controlled fear. Mitchell monitored his engine instruments while watching for the telltale signs of flak damage that could transform fuel consumption calculations into desperate emergency procedures. 2 hours into the mission, Mitchell calculated remaining fuel against distance to target. Under standard fuel consumption, his bomber would be approaching the point of no return. The moment when continuing forward or turning back made no difference to survival odds. But the modified fuel had extended that threshold by nearly 40 minutes of flight time. The aircraft using Hooker's catalyst would reach Berlin with sufficient reserves to complete the bomb run and return to England with normal safety margins. The bombers burning standard fuel would reach the target but face critical fuel shortages during the return flight. Berlin's air defences revealed themselves through concentrated flak barrages that turned the sky into a maze of explosive destruction. Rosenthal's formation maintained course through the defensive fire, bomb bay doors opening as bombardiers prepared for their release runs. Mitchell felt the aircraft lurch upward as 12 500-pound bombs fell away, the sudden weight reduction changing the bomber's flight characteristics. But the mission's success would be measured not in bombs dropped, but in aircraft that returned safely to England. As the formation turned west for the long flight home, Mitchell began the careful fuel management that would determine whether his crew became statistics or survivors. German fighter attacks intensified during the withdrawal from Berlin. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Fokker-Wulf 190Ds tore through the American formation with tactics refined through 3 years of defending Reich airspace. The B-17 seconds using standard fuel faced impossible choices: maintain formation discipline and risk fuel exhaustion, or break formation to conserve fuel and become easy targets for German fighters. Mitchell's bomber, burning Hooker's modified fuel, possessed options that the rest of the formation lacked. Rosenthal could maneuver aggressively to avoid fighter attacks while maintaining fuel reserves sufficient to reach England. The 37 gallons per hour savings had created tactical flexibility that separated survival from disaster. 3 bombers from the Standard Fuel Group were forced to make emergency landings in occupied Belgium when their tanks ran dry 70 miles from English airspace. Their crews became prisoners of war, victims not of German fighters or flak, but of fuel consumption rates that made deep penetration missions mathematically impossible. Mitchell's B-17 crossed the English coast with 45 minutes of fuel remaining in the tanks, sufficient reserves for traffic pattern delays or weather diversions that often occurred at bomber bases managing hundreds of returning aircraft. The other 5 bombers, using Hooker's catalyst, landed with similar reserves, while the surviving aircraft from the Standard Fuel Group touched down with gauges reading empty. That evening, as ground crews refueled the returning bombers, Colonel Timberlake examined flight engineer logs that documented fuel consumption across the entire mission profile. The 6 aircraft using modified fuel had averaged 372 gallons per hour for the complete mission. The 33 surviving bombers using standard fuel had averaged 442 gallons hourly. The difference of 70 gallons per hour translated directly into extended combat radius. Targets that had been beyond B-17 range suddenly became viable objectives. German industrial facilities in eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland could now be struck by bombers that possessed sufficient fuel reserves to complete their missions and return safely. But Hooker's fuel modification presented challenges that extended beyond simple chemistry. The catalyst compound required precise mixing ratios and careful quality control that American fuel supply systems were not designed to provide. Each batch of modified fuel needed testing to verify proper octane levels and combustion characteristics before being loaded into bomber fuel tanks. Production of the catalyst demanded manufacturing capabilities that barely existed in wartime Britain. The chemical ingredients came from scattered sources across England and Scotland, requiring transportation coordination that strained already overtaxed logistics networks. Cost per gallon exceeded standard aviation fuel by margins that made accountants question whether range extension justified the expense. Lieutenant Harold Fisher, 8th Air Force Fuel Supply Officer, calculated that producing enough modified fuel to support wing-level operations would require converting 3 petroleum processing facilities to specialized catalyst production. The industrial commitment would divert resources from other critical programs while creating vulnerabilities if German intelligence learned about the modification and developed countermeasures. But the strategic implications overrode budgetary concerns. The combined bomber offensive, the Allied strategic bombing campaign designed to destroy German war production, had been limited by fuel constraints that made many high-value targets unreachable. Synthetic fuel plants in eastern Germany operated with impunity because Allied bombers lacked the range to strike them and return safely. Ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt had been attacked at devastating cost because the mission profile exceeded fighter escort range, leaving bombers vulnerable to German interceptors for hours of flight time. Oil refineries throughout occupied Europe continued producing aviation fuel for the Luftwaffe because American bomber groups could not reach them with sufficient bomb loads and fuel reserves. Hooker's catalyst changed those calculations. If B-17 bombers could fly 2,100 miles instead of 1,300, the map of viable targets expanded to include nearly every German industrial facility west of the Soviet front lines. But translating laboratory chemistry into operational capability required overcoming institutional resistance that ran deeper than technical challenges. Squadron commanders who had lost crews to experimental modifications viewed any change to standard operating procedures with justified suspicion. Flight engineers who understood bomber fuel systems through hard-won experience questioned whether civilian chemists understood the realities of combat operations at 25,000 feet. Mitchell found himself defending Hooker's technique to fellow flight engineers during post-mission debriefings. The chemistry works, but it requires different engine management than standard fuel, he explained to skeptical colleagues who had watched too many experimental programs fail under operational stress. You can't just pour in the modified fuel and fly normal settings. You need to monitor cylinder head temperatures more carefully and adjust mixture controls based on altitude. The training requirements became apparent during the second mission using modified fuel. 8 bombers experienced engine roughness during climb-out when pilots failed to adjust mixture controls for the altered combustion characteristics. 2 aircraft were forced to abort the mission due to excessive cylinder head temperatures that resulted from improper fuel management. The failures provided ammunition for critics who argued that Hooker's modification created more problems than it solved. Standard fuel might have shorter range, but it worked predictably under all conditions without requiring pilots to become amateur chemists. Combat operations demanded reliability over theoretical performance advantages that only materialized when everything went perfectly. Chief Master Sergeant Donald Blake, senior maintenance officer at Podington, documented the maintenance implications of modified fuel operations in reports that made sobering reading for group commanders. Spark plug fouling increased by 18% in engines burning the catalyst mixture. Engine overhaul intervals decreased by approximately 40 flight hours due to increased thermal stress on cylinder components. Most critically, the modified fuel required storage procedures that standard aviation fuel did not demand. The catalyst compound degraded if exposed to temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, common conditions in unheated British fuel storage facilities during winter months. Contaminated fuel batches could cause catastrophic engine failures that would kill entire bomber crews with no warning beyond rough engine operation that pilots might attribute to normal combat damage. But the strategic necessity drove implementation forward despite technical challenges and institutional resistance. The winter of 1944 brought increasing pressure from Allied commanders to intensify the bombing campaign against German war production. Intelligence reports indicated that Nazi synthetic fuel facilities were operating at maximum capacity, supporting Luftwaffe operations that continued to inflict unsustainable losses on American bomber formations. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, issued orders that made Hooker's fuel modification mandatory for all long-range bomber operations beginning April 1, 1944. The directive came with enhanced training requirements and strict quality control procedures, but the strategic calculus was clear. Extended range capability was worth the operational risks and increased maintenance burden. Mitchell's squadron received intensive briefings on the modified fuel's characteristics during the final weeks of March. Flight engineers learned to recognize the subtle differences in engine behavior that indicated proper catalyst mixture. Pilots practiced mixture control procedures that optimized fuel consumption without sacrificing power output. Ground crews studied storage and handling protocols that prevented fuel degradation. The transformation from experimental program to standard operating procedure occurred with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized American military operations. Technical orders were updated. Fuel supply systems were modified. Training syllabi incorporated new procedures. Within 6 weeks, the modified fuel that Hooker had developed in a Rolls-Royce laboratory became standard aviation gasoline for the 8th Air Force's deep penetration bombing missions. The first strategic test of extended range capability came with missions targeting synthetic fuel plants in central Germany. These facilities, located beyond the combat radius that German air defenses assumed protected them, had operated throughout the war, producing aviation fuel for Luftwaffe fighter wings defending the Reich. On April 19, 1944, 243 B-17 Flying Fortresses launched from bases across eastern England, carrying enough modified fuel to reach targets 400 miles beyond previous bombing range. The formation represented the largest commitment of American strategic bombing assets to a single objective, betting that Hooker's fuel chemistry would deliver the performance characteristics that mission planning assumed. Technical Sergeant Mitchell, now recognized as one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced flight engineers in modified fuel operations, monitored his instruments with the calm attention that separated veterans from replacements. His bomber carried fuel loads that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, flying toward targets that German intelligence still classified as unreachable by Allied aircraft. The success of this mission would determine whether extended-range bombing became standard doctrine or an expensive failure that consumed resources without delivering strategic results. Mitchell understood that he was not just monitoring fuel flow gauges and cylinder head temperatures. He was testing whether American industrial chemistry could overcome German defensive geography. At 24,000 feet over occupied Germany, with fuel consumption tracking exactly as Hooker's calculations predicted, Mitchell allowed himself cautious optimism that the mission would succeed. The B-17's Wright Cyclone engines burned modified fuel with steady efficiency that defied his accumulated instincts about how bombers consumed gasoline at altitude. Behind him, in the waist gun positions, the gunners watched for German fighters that would surely attempt to intercept this unprecedented deep penetration into Reich airspace. Below, German radar, operators tracked the American formation with growing alarm, calculating approach vectors that indicated targets far beyond what Luftwaffe intelligence believed American bombers could reach. The war was changing in ways that neither side fully comprehended. Extended-range bombing capability represented more than incremental improvement in aircraft performance. It signified American industrial capacity to solve strategic problems through technological innovation that German war production could not match or effectively counter. As Mitchell's bomber approached the initial point for its bombing run, he checked his fuel gauges one final time before the organized chaos of the attack would demand his complete attention to damage control procedures. The numbers confirmed what 6 months of development and testing had promised. The B-17 Flying Fortress possessed sufficient fuel reserves to strike this target and return safely to England. German air defences were about to discover that no facility within Nazi-occupied Europe remained beyond the reach of American strategic bombing. The synthetic fuel plant at Leuna emerged through the morning haze as a sprawling industrial complex that German engineers had assumed was protected by geography rather than flak batteries. Located 130 miles southwest of Berlin, the facility produced nearly 30% of the Luftwaffe's aviation fuel, operating at maximum capacity since 1942, without experiencing a single Allied bombing raid. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, Luftwaffe intelligence officer stationed at the plant's defense command post, watched the American bomber formation approach with disbelief that bordered on professional humiliation. His reports to Berlin had consistently assured High Command that Luna remained beyond B-17 combat radius. The mathematics were irrefutable. American bombers based in England could not fly 900 miles round-trip while carrying sufficient bomb loads to damage hardened industrial facilities. Yet 243 flying fortresses were descending through 20,000 feet, bomb bay doors opening as bombardiers prepared for their release runs. Weber reached for the telephone connecting his post to Luftwaffe Fighter Command, reporting an attack that should have been impossible according to every intelligence assessment his department had produced. Mitchell felt his bomber shudder as flak exploded close enough to pepper the fuselage with shrapnel fragments. The formation maintained course through defensive fire that intensified, as German gunners realized they were defending a target that Allied planners had supposedly written off as unreachable. The industrial complex below represented years of German investment in synthetic fuel production, chemical engineering facilities that transformed coal into aviation, gasoline through processes that required enormous energy inputs and technical expertise. Destroying Luna would cripple Luftwaffe operations throughout Central Europe, but only if the American bombers possessed sufficient fuel reserves to complete their bomb runs and survive the return flight through German fighter interceptors that would pursue them relentlessly across occupied territory. Bombs away. The bombardier's voice crackled over the intercom as 12 500-pound high-explosive bombs fell toward the synthetic fuel processing towers below. Mitchell watched the formation's ordnance impact across the target area. secondary explosions indicating hits on fuel storage facilities and chemical processing equipment. The mission's tactical success was undeniable, but strategic significance would be measured by how many bombers returned safely to England with enough fuel reserves to prove that deep penetration bombing was sustainable doctrine rather than desperate gamble. German fighter response came faster and more aggressively than Mitchell had experienced during previous missions. Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 3, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, tore through the American formation with tactics refined through years of defending Reich airspace. The German pilots understood that bombers this far from England would be operating at extreme fuel limits, vulnerable to extended harassment that might force them to jettison bombs early or break formation in fuel-saving attempts to reach safety. But the B-17 seconds burning Hooker's modified fuel possessed reserves that German tactical planning had not anticipated. Rosenthal maneuvered his formation aggressively during the withdrawal from Luyuna, maintaining defensive integrity while his flight engineers monitored fuel consumption that remained within acceptable parameters for the extended mission profile. 3 bombers from Mitchell's group sustained flak damage severe enough to force altitude reductions that increased fuel consumption significantly. Under standard fuel loads, these aircraft would have been abandoned by the formation, their crews facing the choice between bailing out over Germany or attempting desperate emergency landings in occupied territory. The modified fuel provided different options. The damaged bombers could maintain formation at reduced altitude, while still possessing sufficient reserves to reach England if their structural damage did not worsen. The tactical flexibility that extended range capability provided was measured not in miles, but in young men who survived missions that would have killed them under previous fuel constraints. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, pilot of a B-17 that had sustained engine damage during the bomb run, struggled to maintain airspeed with his No. 3 engine shut down and feathered. His flight engineer, Staff Sergeant William Hayes, calculated remaining fuel against distance to friendly territory using arithmetic that would determine whether his crew became prisoners or survivors. "Sir, we're burning 120 gallons per hour on 3 engines instead of the normal 90, Hayes reported over the intercom. But we started the mission with modified fuel reserves that give us approximately 45 minutes more flight time than standard loads. If we can maintain current airspeed and avoid further combat, we'll reach England with minimal reserves." Anderson's bomber fell behind the main formation as German fighters concentrated their attacks on stragglers they assumed would be easy kills. But the P-51 Mustang escort, now equipped with the same extended-range fuel technology that powered the B-17 seconds, maintained protective coverage far deeper into German territory than Luftwaffe tactical planning had anticipated. The convergence of extended-range capabilities in both bombers and their fighter escorts fundamentally altered strategic bombing doctrine. Targets throughout occupied Europe that had been protected by distance suddenly became vulnerable to coordinated attacks that German air defences could neither prevent nor adequately respond to. Mitchell's bomber crossed the Dutch coast with 1 hour and 17 minutes of fuel remaining, sufficient reserves to reach Podington with normal traffic pattern margins. The fuel gauges showed consumption rates that validated 6 months of development work on Hooker's catalyst modification. The B-17 had flown 943 miles, carrying full bomb load, while maintaining formation discipline and engaging in combat maneuvering that would have been impossible under standard fuel constraints. Colonel Timberlake watched the returning bombers land throughout the afternoon, counting aircraft and calculating loss rates that would determine whether the Luyuna mission represented strategic breakthrough or Pyrrhic victory. 229 of the 243 bombers that had launched that morning returned to English bases. 14 aircraft lost to a combination of flak damage, fighter attacks, and mechanical failures unrelated to fuel technology. A 6% loss rate on a mission that previous doctrine had classified as impossible. Strategic bombing operations typically accepted loss rates, approaching 15% for deep penetration missions against heavily defended targets. The lunar raid had achieved its objectives while preserving the bomber force at sustainably low casualties. But the German response was already developing in ways that would test whether extended-range bombing could be maintained against enemies who adapted their defences to counter Allied technological advantages. Hauptmann Weber's report to Luftwaffe High Command sparked emergency meetings among German air defence planners who struggled to understand how American bombers had reached targets that geography should have protected. The initial German theory focused on auxiliary fuel tanks, or aerial refueling, that might have extended B-17 range through external means. Reconnaissance photographs of crashed American bombers revealed no evidence of additional fuel capacity beyond standard tank configurations. Luftwaffe intelligence officers examining wreckage samples found aviation fuel that tested at standard octane ratings, showing no obvious chemical modifications. The possibility that American fuel chemistry had achieved performance breakthroughs that German petroleum engineering could not match was considered and dismissed by experts who understood octane ratings but not the advanced catalytic processes that Hooker had developed. German synthetic fuel production, already operating at maximum capacity to support Wehrmacht operations, lacked the industrial flexibility to experiment with exotic additives or alternative combustion enhancers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders, recognized the strategic implications of American range extension, even if the technical details remained mysterious. In tactical briefings with his squadron leaders, Steinhoff emphasized that every German industrial facility now faced potential bombing raids, regardless of location or presumed safety from Allied air attacks. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, built on the assumption that distance provided protection for facilities beyond certain geographic thresholds, had become obsolete overnight. Fighter wings would need to defend targets throughout occupied Europe, rather than concentrating forces around known high-value objectives within bomber range. American intelligence officers monitoring German radio communications detected the confusion and alarm that the Luna mission had triggered within Luftwaffe command structures. Intercepted messages revealed emergency redeployments of fighter squadrons to protect industrial facilities that had previously operated without dedicated air defense coverage. The strategic dislocation caused by extended-range bombing capability exceeded the immediate damage inflicted on any single target. German air defences were being forced to disperse forces across broader geographic areas, reducing concentration of fighters at critical points and creating gaps that American bombers could exploit during subsequent missions. But the operational demands of maintaining extended-range bombing placed severe strains on Allied fuel supply systems. Hooker's catalyst compound required manufacturing capabilities that barely kept pace with 8th Air Force consumption rates. Each deep penetration mission consumed thousands of gallons of modified fuel that cost significantly more than standard aviation gasoline, while demanding specialized handling procedures. Lieutenant Fisher's fuel supply organization worked around the clock, maintaining adequate stocks of catalyst compound while coordinating distribution to bomber bases across England. The logistics involved shipping chemical ingredients from processing facilities in Scotland, mixing them with base aviation fuel at precise ratios, testing each batch for proper combustion characteristics, and delivering the final product to operational squadrons within timeframes that prevented catalyst degradation. The supply chain vulnerability became apparent when German submarines torpedoed a freighter carrying catalyst precursor chemicals from North American suppliers. The resulting shortage forced 8th Air Force to cancel 3 planned deep penetration missions while emergency stocks were relocated from reserve supplies. Colonel Timberlake found himself managing fuel allocations with the precision that commanders normally reserved for bomb loads and ammunition stores. Each mission required calculating not just the target's strategic value, but also the fuel costs and replacement timelines for catalyst compounds that could not be quickly replenished if supply chains were disrupted. Mitchell noticed the increased pressure on fuel management during briefings for subsequent missions. Flight engineers received detailed instructions on mixture control procedures, cylinder head temperature monitoring, and emergency procedures if modified fuel showed signs of contamination or degradation. The margin for error that made extended-range missions possible was narrower than most crews realized. The mission to the Ploiești oil refineries in Romania tested the outer limits of B-17 range capability, even with Hooker's fuel modification. The target, located over 1,000 miles from English bases, represented one of Germany's most critical petroleum production facilities. Romanian crude oil fed synthetic fuel plants throughout occupied Europe, supporting Wehrmacht operations on the Eastern Front and Luftwaffe fighter wings defending Reich airspace. Strategic planners had identified Ploiești as a priority target since 1942. But the distance involved made bombing raids logistically impossible until extended-range fuel technology provided the capability to strike and return safely. The mission profile required 11 hours of flight time under optimal conditions, pushing modified fuel reserves to their absolute limits. On June 10, 1944, 173 B-17 seconds launched from bases across England, carrying maximum fuel loads and reduced bomb tonnage to compensate for the weight of additional gasoline. Mitchell's bomber, now configured for ultra-long-range operations, carried 2,800 gallons of modified fuel in standard tanks plus auxiliary capacity that had been installed specifically for the Ploiești mission. The flight across occupied Europe revealed the psychological strain that extended-range operations placed on bomber crews. Hours of sustained flight over hostile territory, knowing that mechanical problems or combat damage could eliminate the narrow fuel margins that separated survival from disaster. Mitchell monitored his engine instruments with focused intensity that bordered on obsessive, watching for any indication of abnormal fuel consumption or engine performance degradation. At 26,000 feet over Hungary, German fighter interception began with coordinated attacks from multiple Luftwaffe wings that had been positioned specifically to defend Ploiești from the raids that extended range capability now made possible. The air battle that developed tested every assumption about how bomber formations could defend themselves while maintaining fuel reserves for missions approaching the limits of aircraft endurance. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190Ds attacked in waves, attempting to force American bombers into fuel-wasting combat maneuvers that would leave them vulnerable during the long return flight. But the P-51 Mustang escorts, burning their own version of extended range fuel, provided protection that allowed the B-17 formation to maintain efficient cruise settings while fighting through German defences. The bombing runs over Ploiești achieved devastating results. Romanian oil production facilities that had operated throughout the war with minimal interference sustained damage that would require months of repair work and significantly reduce petroleum output. But the mission's true significance lay not in the bombs dropped, but in the demonstration that no German-controlled facility remained beyond American bombing range. Mitchell's bomber turned west for the return flight with fuel reserves that showed exactly the consumption rates Hooker's calculations had predicted. 11 hours after takeoff, the B-17 landed at Podington with 37 minutes of fuel remaining. Sufficient margin to prove that ultra-long-range bombing was viable, but narrow enough to demonstrate that extended-range operations pushed both aircraft and crews to the limits of bombing, their capabilities. The human cost of extended-range bombing became measurable in crew fatigue statistics that medical officers tracked with growing concern. Missions lasting 10 to 12 hours placed physical and psychological demands on bomber crews that exceeded anything anticipated during aircraft design or training programs. Pilots experienced muscle fatigue from hours of formation flying that required constant attention to airspeed, altitude, and position. Gunners maintained alertness throughout missions that could involve German fighter attacks at any moment during flights that crossed multiple time zones. Flight engineers like Mitchell bore perhaps the greatest burden. Their responsibilities included monitoring 4 complex aircraft engines throughout missions where fuel management errors could kill entire crews. Every gauge reading required interpretation. Every instrument fluctuation demanded immediate response. The mental strain of maintaining vigilance for 12 consecutive hours while operating in oxygen-deprived environments at altitudes where human consciousness lasted mere seconds without pressurization. Chief Flight Surgeon Major Thomas Richardson documented increased incidence of oxygen deprivation symptoms, extreme fatigue, and stress-related performance degradation among crews flying extended-range missions. His medical reports to 8th Air Force Headquarters recommended limiting ultra-long-range operations to maximum frequencies that preserved crew effectiveness while accomplishing strategic objectives. But the pressure to maintain bombing campaign momentum overrode medical concerns about sustainable crew workload. German war production continued operating despite intensifying Allied bombing raids, demonstrating the resilience of distributed industrial systems that could absorb damage and continue functioning. Strategic bombing doctrine required sustained pressure on multiple target categories simultaneously, demanding operational tempo that stretched crews and aircraft to their limits. Mitchell flew his 50th combat mission on August 3, 1944, completing the required number of sorties for rotation back to the United States. His experience with extended-range fuel operations made him valuable as an instructor, but 8th Air Force policy mandated crew rest for personnel who had survived the statistical improbability of 50 missions over occupied Europe. During his final briefing at Podington, Mitchell reflected on the transformation that 6 months had produced in American strategic bombing capabilities. The B-17 Flying Fortress had evolved from an aircraft with severe range limitations into a bomber that could strike targets throughout Nazi-controlled territory. The change had been accomplished not through fundamental airframe redesign, but through chemical innovation that altered fuel combustion characteristics. Hooker's catalyst modification represented exactly the kind of incremental technological advantage that determined military outcomes in industrialized warfare. Not revolutionary weapons that transformed battlefield dynamics overnight, but cumulative improvements that provided decisive margins in sustained operations. Extended range capability did not make individual bombing raids dramatically more successful, but it expanded the number of viable targets and reduced losses to levels that made strategic bombing sustainable over the long campaigns required to defeat industrial enemies. The statistical analysis of extended-range operations revealed patterns that validated the investment in fuel chemistry research. Bomber loss rates on deep penetration missions dropped from 15% to 7% when aircraft could maintain formation discipline without fuel-driven compromises. Mission abort rates decreased by 32%, as mechanical problems that would have forced crews to turn back with standard fuel loads became manageable with extended reserves. Most significantly, the percentage of bombing missions that achieved their primary objectives increased from 61% to 84% when bombers possessed sufficient fuel to complete full attack runs without abbreviated procedures, or early departures from target areas. Strategic bombing effectiveness improved not because American bombers became more accurate or carried heavier bomb loads, but because extended range eliminated fuel constraints that had forced tactical compromises. German industrial production statistics documented the cumulative impact of sustained bombing campaigns enabled by extended range capability. Synthetic fuel output declined by 43% during summer 1944 as facilities throughout occupied Europe sustained repeated raids. Ball bearing production dropped by 37% as manufacturers in eastern Germany lost the geographic protection that distance had previously provided. Aircraft production decreased by 29% as assembly plants faced bombing raids that disrupted supply chains and destroyed specialized machine tools. The percentage declines translated into thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces that Wehrmacht forces never received, weakening German military capabilities during the critical period when Allied armies advanced through France following the Normandy invasion. The strategic significance of extended-range bombing extended beyond immediate target damage to reshape German defensive resource allocation. Luftwaffe fighter wings that might have opposed Allied tactical air operations in France were instead defending industrial facilities throughout occupied Europe. Anti-aircraft batteries that could have supported Wehrmacht ground forces were deployed, protecting synthetic fuel plants and ball-bearing factories from American bomber raids. German industrial planners faced impossible choices about resource distribution. Investing in defensive fortifications to protect facilities from bombing reduced resources available for expanding production capacity. Dispersing manufacturing operations to reduce vulnerability to concentrated bombing raids increased transportation costs and reduced efficiency. Every defensive adaptation consumed resources that could otherwise support Wehrmacht combat operations. The cumulative strain on German war economy reached critical levels by autumn 1944, as Allied bombing campaigns exploited extended-range capabilities to strike multiple target categories simultaneously. Synthetic fuel facilities, transportation networks, electrical power generation, and industrial manufacturing all faced sustained bombing pressure that exceeded German capacity to repair damage or maintain production levels. Oberst Weber, now assigned to Luftwaffe strategic planning after Luna's destruction, authored intelligence assessments that attempted to explain to German High Command how American technological advantages in fuel chemistry had fundamentally altered strategic bombing effectiveness. His reports documented the cascade of consequences that followed from extended bomber range, showing how single innovations could reshape entire military campaigns through cumulative effects that exceeded their immediate tactical impact. But German industrial capacity to respond to American fuel technology remained limited by fundamental economic constraints. Synthetic fuel production already consumed enormous quantities of coal and electrical power, leaving minimal capacity for experimental programs developing enhanced aviation fuels. Chemical engineering expertise was committed to existing production processes that could not be disrupted without catastrophic short-term output reductions. Most critically, German petroleum chemistry had not developed the catalytic processing capabilities that made Hooker's fuel modification possible. The theoretical knowledge existed within German technical literature, but translating laboratory chemistry into industrial-scale production required infrastructure investments that wartime Germany could not afford. The autumn of 1944 brought intensifying pressure on German war production, as Allied bombing campaigns exploited extended-range capabilities to strike targets with precision that geography no longer protected. Mitchell, now training new flight engineers at bases in the United States, received regular updates on missions being flown with fuel technology he had helped validate during combat operations. The reports documented increasing sophistication in extended-range operations as commanders developed tactics that maximized the strategic advantages provided by enhanced fuel efficiency. Bombers struck multiple targets during single missions, exploiting extended range to attack secondary objectives after completing primary bomb runs. Fighter escorts accompanied bombers throughout their mission profiles, eliminating the unescorted flight segments where German interceptors had previously inflicted highest casualties. The transformation in strategic bombing effectiveness that occurred between March and October to 1944 demonstrated how technological innovation could compound advantages through systematic application across entire military operations. Extended range capability did not win the air war through dramatic single missions, but through sustained pressure that German defences could neither prevent nor effectively counter. By December 1944, American bomber forces were conducting operations throughout occupied Europe with loss rates that had declined to 4% of aircraft dispatched. The statistical improvement reflected multiple factors, including improved fighter escort capabilities, enhanced defensive armament, and better tactical procedures. But underlying all these improvements was the extended range capability that Hooker's fuel chemistry had provided. The German surrender in May 1945 ended the European air war before the full implications of extended range bombing could be completely explored. Strategic planners had been developing mission profiles that would have struck targets in eastern Germany and occupied Poland with the same routine frequency that earlier bombing campaigns had attacked facilities in Western Germany. The post-war strategic bombing surveys conducted by Allied intelligence teams documented the effectiveness of various bombing campaigns against German war production. The analysis revealed that attacks on synthetic fuel facilities, made possible by extended range capability, had inflicted more damage on German military effectiveness than any other category of strategic bombing. Petroleum shortages crippled Luftwaffe training programs, grounded fighter wings that possessed aircraft but lacked fuel, and restricted Wehrmacht mobility during critical defensive campaigns. Hooker returned to Rolls-Royce after the war, continuing research into combustion chemistry that would influence jet engine development and civilian aviation fuel formulation. His wartime work on catalyst compounds remained classified for years after Germany's defeat, the technical details protected by military secrecy that prevented competitors from replicating innovations that had provided decisive advantages. Mitchell completed his service obligation and returned to civilian life, carrying technical knowledge about advanced fuel systems that would prove valuable during the post-war aviation boom. His combat experience with extended-range operations influenced his career in aerospace engineering, where principles learned while monitoring fuel gauges over Germany translated into contributions to commercial aviation development. The B-17 Flying Fortresses that had carried modified fuel across occupied Europe were gradually retired from service, replaced by jet-powered bombers that used different propulsion principles. But the fundamental lesson remained relevant across successive generations of military aviation. Strategic reach depended not just on airframe design but on fuel technology that maximized range while maintaining reliability under operational conditions. The extended range capabilities that seemed revolutionary in 1944 became baseline expectations for post-war military aviation. Bombers were expected to strike targets thousands of miles from home bases. Fighters were designed with fuel systems that supported intercontinental deployments. The innovations that Hooker developed under wartime pressure influenced fuel chemistry research programs that continue shaping aviation technology decades later. The young men who flew those missions over Germany carried memories that transcended technical accomplishments or strategic achievements. They remembered the fear of watching fuel gauges over hostile territory, knowing that empty tanks meant certain death. They remembered the relief of crossing the English coast with reserves still showing on instruments. They remembered crews that did not return, lost to flak or fighters or mechanical failures that even extended range capability could not prevent. Technical Sergeant James Mitchell, returning to Podington Airfield for a memorial ceremony 60 years after the war ended, stood before the restored B-17 that represented the aircraft he had flown during 50 combat missions. The bomber's fuel tanks, now empty and inactive, had once held the modified gasoline that had extended American strategic bombing reach into the heart of Nazi Germany. The chemical catalyst that made those missions possible had been a minor footnote in most historical accounts of the air war, overshadowed by more dramatic technological developments like radar, jet engines, and eventually atomic weapons. But for the bomber crews who survived extended-range missions, Hooker's fuel modification represented the margin between life and death measured in gallons rather than miles. Standing in the restored bomber's flight engineer station, Mitchell touched the fuel gauge instruments that he had monitored with obsessive attention throughout missions that tested the limits of aircraft endurance and human resilience. The gauges no longer functioned, their mechanisms frozen by decades of inactivity. But they represented technology that had transformed strategic bombing through chemistry rather than engineering, industrial capacity rather than tactical innovation. The lesson that emerged from extended-range bombing operations transcended specific technical achievements to illustrate broader principles about how wars were won through cumulative advantages rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Single innovations like catalyst-enhanced fuel did not change military outcomes through their immediate impact, but through systematic application that compounded benefits across thousands of missions, millions of operational flight hours. The young men who had climbed into B-17 cockpits during the desperate years of 1944 and 45 had carried with them not just bombs and ammunition, but the weight of industrial civilization's contest with totalitarian enemies. Their survival had depended on petroleum chemists they would never meet, working in laboratories thousands of miles from combat zones, developing innovations that measured victory in percentage improvements rather than revolutionary transformations. Mitchell left the memorial ceremony carrying the same mixture of pride and sorrow that defined his generation's relationship with wartime service. Pride in accomplishments that had contributed to defeating Nazi Germany. Sorrow for friends who had died in aluminum coffins that fell from European skies when fuel ran out or engines failed or German fighters achieved their brief, violent victories. The restored B-17 would remain at Podington as monument to the strategic bombing campaign that had helped end the war in Europe. Its fuel tanks would stay empty, never again filled with the modified gasoline that had extended bomber range beyond what German intelligence had thought possible. But the principles that Hooker's catalyst represented would continue influencing aviation technology, industrial chemistry, and military doctrine through generations that faced their own challenges, requiring innovation under pressure. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.